Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call. And on today's podcast, we're going to talk about taking care of your body, fixing a broken body. Are you one of those people who has spent your lifetime beating the hell out of yourself and then never really taking care of yourself? And let's be clear, there are a lot of ways that you can damage your body from diet. Mm-hmm. So if you're drinking 2 sodas a day,
Mountain Dew,
stuff. Diet soda. If you're eating a lot of bread and sugar, that'll wreck you in various ways. If you've damaged your gut health, that'll wreck you in various ways. If you over-exercise or you injure yourself, you have poor movement patterns, that can cause you to be wrecked. You don't drink enough water, you're continually dehydrated. There's a lot of ways to damage your body over a long period of time and make it so you have an extreme deficit that you don't even know you have. And then it sneaks up on you and destroys you. And a perfect example of what I'm talking about is this chapter coming from Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. In his book, he's got this chapter that is just incredible. It's at the very end of the book. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know, he's a retired Navy SEAL. He went through BUD/S, Navy SEAL training 3 times to make it through. He is an endurance athlete. He's been on Rogan's podcast. He's worked out with Cam quite a bit. If you don't know, he's won some major endurance races and such. And he's an amazing athlete. And the whole book is based on mental toughness, just pushing through, finding a way, and how much more powerful our minds are than we realize, right? That so much of what keeps you from achieving some epic physical feat is actually your mind, not your body. That your mind quits long before your body really has to. Yeah. You can see that in wartime situations. You can see how people do incredible feats of survival when they have to, and they have no other choice. Yep. I'm amazed at my children when I force them into a situation where, hey, we're 7 miles back. The only way you get back is if you hike it. Right. Like there's no way around this. And they do things that they didn't know they could. Yeah. So.
Yep. And even my kids young. So a couple of years ago, we threw our youngest at that time was maybe 2-ish, 1.5, threw him in the backpack. And then my 4-year-old at that time, which was the oldest, he did a 6.5 mile hike with us. And I packed him very little. I mean, they amaze you,
They do. And so we talk about how mental toughness really matters on this podcast all the time. At the same time, our bodies have a finite number of joint movements, and your body only can do so much before it breaks. And you can make it last longer, just like a vehicle that you take care of versus when you don't do oil changes on, you don't change the tires, you have everything gets old. Yep. And in this book by David Goggins, I love this chapter. It's pretty remarkable. By the time you get to this chapter, he has won a ton of races. He's defied the odds. He's maybe not as physically gifted as you would expect. And he's making the case that, I was this big fat dude and I changed who I was through mental toughness, and my body is a reflection of my mind. Yeah. But he gets to a point where he has stacked up some body damage and it creeps up on him. And this is kind of mind-boggling what ends up happening to him. So I'm going to jump into the book. I'm just going to read from this chapter. I think you're going to really get something out of this. So before we do that, I want to remind you that I have partnered with Mountain Ops to do a Gritty Off-Road Package giveaway. And right now, every $5 you spend at Mountain Ops, you get 10 entries to win a $30,000 Polaris RZR Turbo S. And it's pretty sweet. Mm-hmm. So if you're getting some stuff at Mountain Ops, use the code GRITTY and you get an extra 10 entries to win. So that's going on until May 15th, and then we're going to announce the winner on May 18th. It's a really cool giveaway. Check it out. This machine is pretty awesome. And then also, if you're out there getting ready for your spring bear hunts, probably not turkey hunts. You don't really need trekking poles for turkey hunts, although there are some backcountry turkey hunts happening lately.
There's some backcountry Idaho turkey.
Yeah, there are. Anthony's done a couple. Check out our boys over at Sissy Sticks. Those trekking poles are legit. We have put them through the paces. They're carbon fiber upper, aluminum lower. Get a pair. Use the code GRITTY. All right, we're jumping into the book. Basically, he was living in Chicago at the time, and David Goggins is now, after years, he's become a BUD/S prep instructor. It's basically a school that helps candidates deal with the reality that they would face in the actual BUD/S selection process for Navy SEALs. And so he had been serving in the military for more than 20 years. He was working on helping younger guys get through it. And he was running a lot at the time. He was doing, what did he say, a total of 130 miles per week he was running. Some 40-mile days sometimes. He added some heat training in at that time. He was wearing a beanie and a Gore-Tex jacket, and he'd hit the streets in the hot sun. He'd show up at work. And, of course, everyone of the fellow SEAL team members thought he was a little bit nuts as he pulled off all those clothes and trash bags. And so he's intense, there's no question. And he says, I started my taper 4 weeks out. Tapering is this process that an athlete goes to that's supposed to generate an abundance of energy as you eat and rest. So you work out really hard, you peak, and then you kind of taper off, which then gives you a lot of recovery time and supposed to give you all this energy. But he's like, dude, I didn't feel energy. Instead, I never felt worse. I wasn't hungry and couldn't sleep at all. Some people said my body was starved of calories. Others suggested I might be low on sodium. My doctor measured my thyroid, and it was a little off, but the readings weren't so bad to explain how crappy I felt. Perhaps the explanation was simple. I was overtrained. So at this point, he's got some problem. He doesn't know what it is. He feels like garbage. And it's 2 weeks before he runs in the Badwater race again, which is this nasty desert race that is an endurance race. And he was going to run it in 2014. This is 2014. And 2 weeks before he goes, he was considering pulling out because he was worried about his heart. Earlier, I think a couple years early, he had heart surgery,
right?
Because he had a hole in his heart, which he didn't know this the whole time. Could have killed him, but didn't. And so that kind of set him back, and he was really devastated by that. And he got the heart thing fixed, and then he was back in business. He's the top of the world again. But here he is having some problems, and he's not feeling good, and he's wondering if it has something to do with the earlier heart condition, right? I worried it was my heart again because on easy runs, I felt a surge of adrenaline that I couldn't vent. Even a mellow pace sent my pulse racing into arrhythmia. 10 days before the race, I landed in Vegas. I'd scheduled 5 runs, but couldn't get past the 3-mile mark on any of them. That's pretty rough for someone like him. Yeah. I wasn't eating that much, but the weight kept piling on. It was all water. I sought out another doctor who confirmed there was nothing physically wrong with me. And when I heard that, I was not about to be a pussy. During the opening miles and initial climb of Badwater 2014, my heart rate ran high. But part of that was the altitude, and 22 miles later, I made it to the top in 6th or 7th place. Surprised and proud, I thought, let's see if I can go downhill. I've never enjoyed the brutality of running down a steep incline because it shreds the quads, but I also thought it would allow me to rest and calm my breath. I love downhill, dude. Bring on the quad shred. Yeah. I hate the uphill. He says, my body refused. I couldn't catch my breath at all. I hit the flat section at the bottom, slowed my pace, and began to walk. My competitors passed me by as my thighs twitched uncontrollably. My muscle spasms were so bad, my quads looked like there was an alien rattling around inside them. And I still didn't stop. I walked for 4 miles before seeking shelter in a Lone Pine motel room where the Badwater medical team had set up shop. They checked me out and saw that my blood pressure was a bit low but easily corrected. They couldn't find a single metric that could explain how effed I felt. I ate some solid food, rested, and decided to try one more time. There was a flat section leaving Lone Pine, and I thought if I could knock that out, perhaps I'd catch a second wind. But 6 or 7 miles later, my sails were still empty, and I'd given all I had. My muscles trembled and twitched. My heart jumped up and down the chart. I looked over at my pacer and said, "That's it, man. I'm done." My support vehicle pulled up behind us, and I climbed inside. A few minutes later, I was laying on the same motel bed with my tail between my legs. I'd lasted just 50 miles, but any humiliation that came with quitting, not something I was used to, was drowned out by an instinct that something was way the F off. It wasn't my fear talking or my desire for comfort. This time I was certain that if I didn't stop trying to break through this barrier, I wouldn't make it out of the Sierras alive. We left Lone Pine for Las Vegas the next night, and for 2 days I did my best to rest and recover, hoping my body would settle somewhere close to equilibrium. We were staying at the Wynn, and on the third morning I went for a jog to see if I had anything in the tank. 1 mile later, my heart was in my throat, and I shut it down. I walked back to the hotel, knowing that, despite what the doctor said, I was sick and suspected that whatever I had was serious. Later that night, after seeing a movie in the Vegas suburbs, I felt weak as we strolled to a nearby restaurant, the Elephant Bar. My mom was a few paces ahead, and I saw her in triplicate. I clenched my eyes, released them, and there was still 3 of her. She held the door open for me, and when I stepped into the cool confines, I felt a bit better. We slid into a booth opposite one another. I was too unsteady to read the menu and asked her to order for me. From there, it got worse, and when the runner showed up with our food, my vision blurred again. And basically, he gets more and more sick, and he says, "You're going to have to call the ambulance because I'm going down." Desperate for some stability, I laid my head on the table, but my mom didn't dial 911. She crossed to my side, and I leaned on her as we made our way to the hostess stand and then back to the car. On the way, I shared as much of my medical history as I could recall in short bursts in case I lost consciousness and she did have to call for help. Luckily, my vision and energy improved enough for her to drive me to the emergency room herself. So something is wrong because Goggins has done some remarkable physical feats here.
Exactly.
This is on another level. Something isn't right.
And he knows it.
Yeah. So he says, my thyroid had been flagged in the past, so that's the first thing the doctors explored. Many Navy SEALs have thyroid issues, and he talks about how Hell Week, he'd been through extreme environments, he'd been through war, and it's typical for Navy SEALs to have hormones go haywire. When the thyroid gland is suboptimal, fatigue, muscle aches, and weakness are among more than a dozen major side effects, but his thyroid levels were close to normal. So that it makes sense. His heart checked out too, and the ER docs in Vegas told him all he needed was rest. He goes back to Chicago and he sees his own doctor, and he gets a bunch of blood tests. And everything came back clean except for thyroid, which was slightly suboptimal, but that didn't explain how he'd morph from an elite athlete capable of running hundreds of miles into a pretender who could barely muster the energy to tie his shoes. So he was in medical no man's land. He says, I left the doctor's office with more questions than answers and a prescription for thyroid medication. You know, the doctors aren't able to help him. He doesn't know what the hell's going on. Something is wrong. He says, each day that went by, I felt worse. Everything was crashing on me. I had trouble getting out of bed. I was constipated and achy. They took more blood and decided I had Addison's disease, an autoimmune disease, adrenals smoked. He said, my doctor prescribed the steroid hydrocortisone, DHEA, Arimidex, among other meds, but taking pills only accelerated his decline. And after that, he and other doctors were tapped out. They didn't know what was wrong. The look in their eyes said it all. In their minds, they thought he was either crazy hypochondriac or was dying, and they didn't know what was killing me or how to deal with it.
Pretty serious.
Yeah, you're pretty wrecked at that point, and your whole life has been being indestructible, has been spent being like that unstoppable dude. So he says he fought through it for the best he could, and his coworkers didn't know anything about his medical decline because he continued to show no weakness when he was around them. You know, he says his whole life he'd been hiding his insecurities and his trauma because his childhood was messed up. Yeah, very dangerous and abusive father, and you know all of that's in the book early on. So you know what he's been through. The man is hard as nails. He said, I kept all my vulnerabilities locked down beneath an iron veneer, but eventually the pain became so bad I couldn't even get out of bed. I called in sick and lay there staring at the ceiling and wondered, could this be the end? So then he talks about how, you know, at this low point in his life, it forced him to stop and actually ponder, like do some meditation really and self-introspection. And it's true for all of us. You know, when Suzanne got cancer and we were going through cancer, that was a real hard and dark time for me. And it fundamentally changed who I am. I think all of us, you hit these dark periods in life where maybe everything you live for or hope for changes on you, and you've got to pick up the pieces. It can wreck you, or it can be you're born again as something different.
Yep, and you can grow from it, be so much stronger.
Mm-hmm. And he says, peering into the abyss sent my mind reeling back through the days, weeks, years, like fingers flipping through old files. He said he found all the best parts and tacked them together into a highlight loop streamed on repeat. He said, I grew up beat down and abused, filtered, uneducated through a system that rejected him at every turn until he took ownership and started to change his life instead of blaming everyone else. Since then, I'd been obese. I was married and divorced. I had 2 heart surgeries, taught myself to swim, learned to run on broken legs. I was terrified of heights, then took up high altitude skydiving. Water scared the crap out of me, yet I became a technical diver, an underwater navigator, which is several degrees of difficulty beyond scuba diving. I competed in more than 60 ultra distance races, winning several, and set a pull-up record. I stuttered through my early years in primary school and grew up to become the Navy SEAL's most trusted public speaker. I'd served my country on the battlefield. Along the way, I became driven to make sure that I could not be defined by the abuse I was born into or the bullying that I grew up with. I was the sum total of the obstacles I had overcome. And even though I told my story to my students all over the country, I never stopped long enough to appreciate the tale I told or the life I'd built. In my mind, I didn't have the time to waste. I never hit snooze on my life clock because there was always something else to do. If I worked a 24-hour day, I'd work out for an hour and sleep for 3. My brain wasn't wired to appreciate. It was programmed to do work. Scan the horizon, ask what's next, and get that done. That's why I piled up so many rare feats. I was always on the hunt for the next big thing. But as I lay there in bed, my body taut with tension and throbbing with pain, I had a clear idea what was next for me. The cemetery. After years of abuse, I'd finally shredded my physical body beyond repair. I was dying. And it's interesting because, of course, this is an extreme situation, but I think it's very common for human beings to go through life, especially if you're a fairly intense person, to just go, and you just do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and you never pause.
And that can be on so many different levels, too, to just a basic level to a Goggins level, you know? I mean, it's so extreme.
Yeah.
And
you can be the world's leading daycare mom, right? And run a daycare, and it's like, it can be whatever. You can be a doctor.
Yeah.
You can be, it doesn't matter. The point is, he had pushed for so long, so hard, conquering one mountain after the other, after the other, after the other, that he hadn't taken the time to like stop and evaluate things.
Yeah. And reflect on his accomplishments even, you know.
Or what he wanted or where he was headed or anything. And this moment brought him to that spot. But what's interesting is as he's sitting there looking at it, he felt like, okay, this is it. I'm going to die.
Yeah.
You know, something isn't right. And back to the book, he says, for weeks and months, I searched for a cure to my medical mystery. But in that moment of catharsis, I didn't feel sad and I didn't feel cheated. I was only 38 years old, but I'd lived 10 lives and experienced a hell of a lot more than most 80-year-olds. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. It made sense that at some point the toll would come due. I spent hours reflecting back on my journey. This time I wasn't sifting through the cookie jar while in the heat of battle hoping to find a ticket to victory. I wasn't leveraging my life assets towards some new end. No, I was done fighting, and all I felt was gratitude. You know, it's interesting. I say this all the time. If you want to combat darkness, there's rarely very few things that can do it like gratitude. Being grateful is the antidote to so much misery and pain and sorrow. It's really hard to be grateful and also at the same time be caught up in your ego and pride because gratitude requires humility. They're hand in hand.
Yep.
So it's interesting at this moment, he could become bitter, angry, twisted, all that. And instead he's like, you know what? I just feel gratitude. I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah.
I think it was the first time in his life he felt like, okay.
Almost felt accomplished or whatever, because
like he's been letting himself haunt himself for so long. And he's like, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm actually grateful. Hardship has the capability of making human beings into remarkable things. It's like a refiner's fire. You've been forged, you've been beaten down, and either you rise to the occasion and you overcome and you get better and better, or you crumble, right? And Goggins is one of those guys that just kept coming back, rising to the occasion and overcoming the next thing. You could be the sort of person that says, when he was the fat dude spraying pest control, he was the dude that blamed everybody, his dad and everything else, for his life and who he was. Later, when he takes ownership, instead, he's like, I'm glad I had that experience. I'm actually glad I grew up this way because it's made me
He talks about it makes him hard, makes him tough, you know?
And which makes him feel more accomplished and fulfilled, you know? And I think it's a universal truth. And that gratitude, being grateful for whatever conditions you're on, it's a form of extreme ownership. No question.
Yep.
Back to the book, he says, I wasn't meant to be this person. I had to fight myself at every turn, and my destroyed body was my biggest trophy. In that moment, I knew it didn't matter if I ever ran again, if I couldn't operate anymore, or if I lived or died. And with that acceptance came deep appreciation. He says, rage is a powerful thing, and for years I raged at the world, channeled all my pain from my past, and used it as fuel to propel me into the stratosphere. But I couldn't always control the blast radius. Sometimes my rage scorched people who weren't as strong as I'd become or didn't work as hard, and I didn't swallow my tongue or hide my judgment. I let them know, and that hurt some of the people around me, and it allowed people who didn't like me to affect my military career. But lying in bed on that Chicago morning in the fall of 2014, I let all that judgment go. This is sort of his moment of truth. And so he kind of sorts through all that. And this really isn't the point of today's discussion, right, but it helps put the rest of this in context.
Yeah.
The physical ailments that he was experiencing and how his body was all jacked up and messed up over years, you can see with a guy this intense, how hard he'd pushed himself. And here he is thinking he's going to die. And in that moment, he had some spiritual experiences, basically.
Yep. And that's in such a short period, too.
Right.
You know, I mean, within 2 weeks, he was prepping for the race, and he's to this point now.
Yes. So he continues in this chapter. He goes on about this enlightenment he feels and how this sort of changes him, and he's able to let go and find some spiritual relief in a sense. And then he says, for hours, I floated in that tranquil space, surrounded by light, feeling as much gratitude as pain, as much appreciation as there was discomfort. At some point, the reverie broke like a fever. I smiled, placed my palms over my watery eyes, and rubbed the top and then the back of my head. At the base of my neck, I felt a familiar knot. It bulged bigger than ever. I threw off the covers and examined the knots above my hip flexors next. Those had grown too. Could it be that basic? Could my suffering be linked to those knots? I flashed back to a session with an expert in stretching and advanced physical and mental training methods that the SEALs brought to our base in Coronado in 2010. The guy's name was Joe Hippensteel. So he talks about this undersized collegiate athlete who then joins the Olympic team, tries to go get into the Olympics and compete. Turns out he's kind of a small guy, 5'8", in a field of 6'3" guys, right. A little undersized to be an Olympic, a real winner in the Olympics. He ends up getting injured, this guy. When Joe Hippensteel was told he tore his hamstring before the trials, his Olympic dreams died, and he realized he needed to change the way he trained his body. And then it says he began balancing his strength work with extensive stretching and noticed whenever he reached a certain range of motion in a given muscle, group, or joint, whatever pain lingered vanished. And so he became his own guinea pig and developed optimal ranges of motion for every muscle and joint in the human body. He never went to the doctor or physical therapists again because he found his own methodologies much more effective. If an injury cropped up, he treated himself with a stretching regimen. Over the years, he built up a clientele and reputation among elite athletes in the area, and in 2010 was introduced to some Navy SEALs. Word spread at Naval Special Warfare Command, and he was eventually invited to introduce his range of motion routine to about 24 SEALs, and I was one of them. So he lectures these guys, he stretches them out, and he said the problem with most of the guys was their overuse of muscles without appropriate balance of flexibility. And those issues trace back to Hell Week, when they were asked to do thousands of flutter kicks, then lie back in cold water with waves washing over them. Joe estimated it would take 20 hours of intensive stretching using his protocol to get most of us back to a normal range of motion in the hips, which can then be maintained, he said. with just 20 minutes of stretching every day. Optimal range of motion required a larger commitment. When he got to me, he took a good look and shook his head. As you know, I'd tasted 3 hell weeks. He started to stretch me out and said I was so locked up, it was like trying to stretch steel cables. So pretty freaking amazing. And so, you know, you think about that, and he was wired tight.
Yeah.
Right? What's interesting is this guy's take. He said it would take 20 hours of his stretching protocol to get these guys back into good movement patterns, good mobility, and then it would take 20 minutes a day to keep them there. And these are young dudes in their 20s.
In shape.
Yeah. I so understand this. And, you know, this range of motion issue, it matters. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of why I'm bringing this up is I figured that out about 10 years ago. And as I got more into CrossFit and weightlifting movements, I found that when I tried to do a deep squat with the bar on my back and I couldn't get into a position, I realized I didn't have range of motion there.
Right.
If I tried to do a snatch and put the bar over my head and do an overhead squat, no range of motion there. I couldn't get down into those. I felt really unstable in some of those positions. And over time, I've been able to get stronger through a full range of motion. You and I were in the gym today. We were doing squats, heavy squats. Being able to go through the full range of motion all the way down, you know, ass to grass, and then stand back up with the bar and feel stable with a really heavy load. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to do.
You're not pointing this towards me, are you?
No. I mean,
No. I need some work. It's been a long time.
You haven't been in the gym in a long time. Yeah. But and you get away with stuff for a long time. But what I find when I do that, and the reason I am a proponent of getting under a bar like that, is because it does challenge my range of motion under load. It restores mobility that I don't have. It's really what I do to stretch.
Yeah.
I want open hips, good strong hip flexors, low back strength, all these things. Well, when I use moderate heavy weight, you know, body weight, and I do a deep squat in a controlled fashion, and I do that week after week, and I open up the hips and I stretch, and then I follow up with massage, like with a lacrosse ball or a foam roller or the Theragun right now. That's been a game changer.
Right, yeah.
And I hit these spots and I keep exercising them and then doing soft tissue work, exercising and soft tissue. And it's stretching, rolling. It's all this stuff together. So we'll continue reading what David Goggins experiences here. He says, this guy, Joe Hippenstill, he's telling David, hey, dude, you're going to need hundreds of hours. You're so messed up. Like the rest of the team, we can get them fixed in 20 hours of stretching. You're going to need hundreds of hours. And this is what David says. He says, at the time, I didn't pay him any mind because I had no plans to take up stretching. Right. That's what I was saying earlier when we started this podcast. So many dudes, like Cameron Haynes is a good example, spend lifetimes of just, I'm not going to stretch, man. Yeah. I'm not going to stretch.
He stretches every day now.
He stretches every day, you know. And it's critical.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'll ever get to the point where I actually like it.
Yeah.
I do like how I feel after I'm done. And I have these 20-minute protocol in the morning, afternoon, and evening stretching routines that I go through. And I have to keep everything moving.
One prime example is you turned me on to probably 6 months ago, because I had lower back issues a lot. Mm-hmm. And I'm not like a super fit guy, but I'm in shape. But that would wreck me. And where 4 years prior, there was maybe a week period where the only comfortable position would be in the fetal position on the floor. You know, and it's old high school injuries, football, rodeo, things like that. But when I started stretching and using a lacrosse ball on like my hips and my glutes and stuff like that, every now and then that pain's still there, but it is nothing like it used to be. And that sciatic and things like that, you know.
It's incredible how it feels when you start doing all this work on yourself to get things that are stuck unstuck.
And I obviously was never at this extreme, but I never hardly stretched. I mean, I used to prior years, high school, right out of high school, but since then, I never stretched anytime. Right.
It's amazing what stretching will do for you. Yeah. It just like, it sort of feels weird though. Why should we have to? Like, why aren't our bodies just like, why isn't that something that isn't required? You can just exercise and then go on.
Yeah.
but you can't, especially the older you get. Things just get stuck, and stretching is a vital part of maintaining good health as you get older. And we'll see further as he describes what happens next. You'll see him kind of illustrate this point. He said, I was obsessed with strength and power, and everything I read suggested that an increase in flexibility meant an equal and opposite decrease in speed and force. But the view from my deathbed altered my perspective. I pulled myself up, staggered to the bathroom mirror, turned, and examined the knot on my head. I stood as tall as I could. I looked like I'd lost not 1, but nearly 2 inches in my height. My range of motion had never been worse. What if Joe was right? What if? One of my mottos these days is peaceful but never satisfied. It was one thing to enjoy the peace of self-acceptance and my acceptance of the effed up world as it is, but that didn't mean I was going to lie down and wait to die without at least trying to save myself. It didn't mean then, and it doesn't mean now, that I will accept the imperfect or just plain wrong without fighting to change things for the better. I'd tried accessing the mainstream mind to find healing, but the doctors and their drugs didn't do crap, except make me feel a whole lot worse. I had no other cards to play. All I could do is try to stretch myself back to health. The first posture was simple. I sat on the ground and tried to cross my legs Indian style, but my hips were so tight, my knees were up around my ears. I lost my balance and rolled onto my back. It took all my strength to right myself and try again. I stayed in position for 10 seconds, maybe 15, before straightening my legs because it was too damn painful. Cramps squeezed and pinched every muscle in my lower body. Sweat oozed from my pores, but after a short rest, I folded up my legs and took more pain. I cycled through the same stretch on and off for an hour, and slowly my body started to open. I did a simple quad stretch next, the one we all learned to do in middle school. Standing on my left leg, I bent my right and grabbed my foot with my right hand. Joe was right. My quads were so bulky and tight, it was like stretching steel cables. Again, I stayed in the posture until the pain was a 7 out of 10. Then I took a short break and hit the other side. That standing posture helped to release my quad and stretch out my psoas. The psoas is the only muscle connecting your spine to our lower legs. It wraps around the back of the pelvis, governs the hips, and is known as the fight or flight muscle. As you know, my whole life was fight or flight. As a young kid drowning in toxic stress, I worked that muscle overtime. Ditto during my 3 hell weeks, Ranger School, and Delta selection. Not to mention war. Yet I never did anything to loosen it up, and as an athlete, I continued to tap my sympathetic nervous system and had been grinding so hard my psoas continued to stiffen, especially on long runs where sleep deprivation and cold weather came into play. Now my psoas was trying to choke me from the inside out. I learned later that it had tilted my pelvis, compressed my spine, and wrapped my connective tissue tight. It had shaved 2 inches off my height. I spoke to Joe about it recently. We're going to get into what Joe's response is. So for those who don't know, the psoas runs kind of up in front of the hip flexors a little bit, and it does wrap around, and a lot of people have severe problems with it, and they don't even know it.
Yep.
And that So Right device, like it's kind of like a horse saddle.
Yep.
Just a little plastic U-shaped horse saddle. A lot of folks seem to be able to hit their psoas muscle laying on top of that, and it breaks down those stuck muscles, and people seem to find a way to get major relief from that. That they've had that problem for years. They get on that a couple times a day, and it's like completely changed their lives. Their backs don't hurt, you know. I've been using it, but I don't really feel much from it. I don't know that I have a problem in that area like some people do.
See, like me, I know I do. I know for sure.
I probably do. I don't know.
Even into my hip flexors, like
my hip flexors, absolutely.
I know, but then I feel it's just way deeper, way beyond my hip flexors. You know, something I should probably look into.
Yeah. Well, Joe Hippensteel responds to this whole thing, and he says, what was happening to you, David, is an extreme case of what happens to 90% of the population. Your muscles were so locked up that your blood wasn't circulating very well. They were like a frozen steak. You can't inject blood into a frozen steak, and that's why you were shutting down.
That's insane.
That's crazy concept, you know, to be that tight that your muscles can't even get blood flow.
Yeah.
Causing heart issues, and, you know, everything's connected.
It's all a muscle.
Well, that's the whole thing that people don't realize is that everything is connected. You got a problem with one thing, it's going to ripple down to another. It's just like your car. you got something wrong with, one of the axles, and it's just going to trickle on through and start wrecking everything else as well. Things got to be lined up. Back to the book, David said, and it wouldn't let go without a fight. Each stretch plunged me into the fire. I had so much inflammation and internal stiffness, the slightest movement hurt. Say nothing of long hold poses meant to isolate my quad and psoas. When I sat down and did the butterfly stretch next, the torture intensified. I stretched for 2 hours that day, woke up sore as hell, and got back after it. On day 2, I stretched for 6 full hours. I did the same 3 poses over and over, then tried to sit on my heels in a double quad stretch that was pure agony. I worked a calf stretch in 2. Each session started off rough, but after an hour or 2, my body released enough for the pain to ease up. I worked a calf stretch in 2. Each session started off rough, but after an hour or 2, my body released enough for the pain to ease up. Before long, I was folded into stretches for upwards of 12 hours a day. I woke up at 6 a.m., stretched until 9. That's 3 hours of stretching, Brad. And then stretched on and off while at the desk at work, especially when I was on the phone. I'd stretch out during my lunch hour, and then after I got home at 5 p.m., and I would stretch until I hit the sack.
I hate stretching for 10 minutes,
He said, I came up with a routine, started at my neck and shoulders before moving into the hips, psoas, glutes, quads, hamstrings, and calves. Stretching became my new obsession. I bought a massage ball to tenderize my psoas. I propped a board up against a closed door at a 70-degree angle and used it to stretch out my calf. I've been suffering for the better part of 2 years, and after several months of continual stretching, I noticed the bump at the base of my skull had started to shrink, along with the knots around my hip flexors, and my overall health and energy level improved. I wasn't anywhere close to flexible yet, and I wasn't completely back to myself. But I was off all but my thyroid medication, and the more I stretched, the more my condition improved. I kept at it for at least 6 hours a day for weeks, then months and years. I'm still doing it. So, there you have it. There's the example I was talking about, how you can wreck your body, put it through all these paces, do all this exercise, intense hiking, climbing, whatever it is that you do, basketball, or just sit in a desk and type on a computer, which is probably worse, far worse long term than actually climbing, or doing heavy loads. It's sitting behind a computer in the same position all day long. That wrecks you.
It's brutal.
It wrecks your hips. It wrecks your back. Yep. And you have a lot of work to do to fix it. I said this the other day on another podcast, talking about people that are wrecked, getting in shape, staying fit at 45. Look, people have wrecked themselves. They've taken themselves through inactivity to a place where they feel like David Goggins when they work out. They go and they do some exercises, and they're so wrecked that they're like, I'm done. I can't keep going. I'm just old. Things don't work like they used to. It's over. Yep. And I truly, truly believe that the human body is remarkable in what you can do to restore it. It wants to be restored. It wants to be better. Yep. You eat clean, you drink water, you exercise, and you stretch like this, and you work on those things, and you're going to, over time, you're going to fix yourself. Yeah. And the thing is, looking at David, he didn't just stretch for 10 minutes. Right?
Hours.
When he was wrecked, he was stretching 12 hours a day. And he was feeling like almost like very, very minimal improvements each day. And it ended up being a thing where it wasn't, I'm sure I've experienced similar things when I had a slipped disc in my back. A herniated disc. It took a long time of incremental changes before I could finally be functional again. Yeah. And so these things are he basically stretched on faith. Well, I got nothing else to lose. Yeah. I've avoided it my whole life. If I dig in and I do 12 hours a day, 9 hours a day, 6 hours a day of stretching, it's all I got left. And he was all in for months and months on end until he started to experience improvement. I feel like for me, that's a secret to my wellness at my age. It's a holistic package, a holistic approach. It's not just the exercise. Yeah. It's not just getting good sleep. It's not just diet. It's also stretching, all the soft tissue work. And that Theragun has been That thing has been remarkable for me. I want to maybe get that Tim Tam version. I need one that's a little more intense.
Goes a little deeper.
It's funny because that Theragun at first, the first 2 weeks, it was like, man, it seemed everywhere it hit, it was just like, oh, geez, man, that hurts. And now everywhere it hits, it's like, it don't hurt at all because all that tissue has become supple and loose again. And so it's not painful because the tissue is loose and fluid, right? And that's what happens. Those muscle fibers and stuff, they break, they get smooth and everything stretches and things aren't tight. And then when you hit something like with a massage gun or a lacrosse ball and it doesn't hurt, it's because there's no soreness.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yep.
And now it's like, for me to hit this, like really get at some stuck parts, like my hip flexors or right here, basically all around my hips. I've got to have a Theragun that's stronger because it's sort of getting the spot, but I gotta jackhammer that thing in there or get on a lacrosse ball and dig in deep. And it kind of touches the soreness and works on it, but it's not getting it like it was. So I love the thing and it's been remarkable. It just goes to show how effective it's been that I've used it to the point where it's not powerful enough to get at I'm just refining my fit in the muscles right now. And it feels really good. Super stoked. Cam Haynes turned me on to that. But again, this is how important it is. The movement patterns, good movement patterns, stretching, range of motion. Like that athlete said, the therapist, physical therapist, he's like, what he found was he had maybe a jacked up quad and hamstring. But as soon as he was able to have full range of motion movement, meaning he can go to a full squat, full range of motion, that he noticed that when he could achieve that, his pain was also gone at the same time. And if you think about it, when can you not squat into a full squat? When can you not put a bar overhead, for example, because your shoulder's impinged?
Right.
When can you not do that? It's when you've got something jacked up.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly.
When things aren't jacked up, you're very able to move into full range of motion.
Yep. And reemphasize on what David says is he didn't start noticing any improvement until 2 months?
Yeah.
So
deep into
2 months, and it's not going to happen over time.
This is what I know, and I say this often to my wife, that there are a lot of guys who will never be that fit.
Yeah.
And the reason is because being in shape hurts. It's painful. He talked about doing that quad stretch, and he just did it for like 15 minutes. So it went from a pain level of a 10 to a 7.
Yeah.
Most people, when it's a pain level 10, they're just, screw it, I'm not doing this.
I'm done.
And when I hit the lacrosse ball or I hit the Theragun on tissue and it's a pain level 10, most people are like, no, not doing it.
Yeah.
I'm not going through this. If you're tough enough, you go from the 10 to a 7 and later to a 5. And when you try to maintain, then you're like, you're at 5s with a flare up to a 7 every now and then. And it's a whole lot more bearable. But most dudes and gals are not willing to suffer through the 10. There's so many people I know that I'm like, here, use this lacrosse ball. And they hit it on their back and they're like, oh, it hurts bad. And forget it. I'm not going to do that. And it's like, that's exactly what you need to do.
Yeah.
Quit being a wuss, quit being a sissy, and just get after it.
And at the same time, it all goes back to a mental toughness, because it hurts.
Yeah.
But you gotta shut your mind off to, okay, it's only going to get better.
Right. Well, the thing that I think you got to realize is it feels good to be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 30 minutes of stretching I do in the morning and the rolling and all that it sucks at first, but 30 minutes later, when I climb out of bed, I feel pretty dang stiff.
Yeah.
Because I push myself. Then I do my stretching routine and all that. 30 minutes later, I feel young again. But if I skip that in the morning, I have things that are not right.
Yeah.
And it's always a continual process. If I eat some pizza and some root beer, which doesn't happen very often, I am freaking stiff the next day. So what you eat has a huge impact on inflammation and soreness as well. So I try not to do that. Like a donut, those things don't appeal to me now because I'd rather eat other things that are still delicious, but don't have the downside, the side effects that some of that other crap does.
I'm not to that level yet.
You're also just 31, so you can get away with a lot of crap.
Yeah, but I've noticed once you hit 30 that things don't recover as quickly as they used to.
And it gets exponentially worse.
Yeah, so I got to start somewhere. Yeah. So I hit the gym for the first time in 3 or 4 years today. So
the next podcast, I'm going to talk about knee pain and joint pain and how a lot of guys are having achy knees when they hike and climb and do things. And there's some reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons that can contribute to that, but there are a few things that you can do to make those achy knees be a thing of the past. And I'm going to address that in the next podcast. I really don't have any achy knees. It's not a problem I've had. I've had it at times when I don't exercise and I eat crap and I don't go through the routines I do. But because I do that, those achy knee things they're ancient history. Yeah. And I know a lot of guys that have problems with that. And, it's not just their knees. It could be their ankles as well. And where we do so much with backpacks and hiking, carrying out meat and so on, it's going to be a useful show for you. Plus, all this stuff doesn't just apply to hunting. It just makes your whole quality of life better. Right. So be looking for that episode here in a couple days. Before we close out, I just want to remind you, you can win an off-road package at Mountain Ops. And also, if you need some backpacking tents, teepees, and stoves at Seek Outside, use the code GRITTY and you get a discount. You use the code GRITTY at Heather's Choice for some backpacking food. You get 15% off there. And hit up Valkyrie Archery for some Blood Eagle or Jaeger broadheads for your archery gear. Cracksaw game bags. Check those guys out too for 6.2 ounce game bags. Use the code GRITTY over there and you'll save on those super lightweight meat bags. They're legit. We been using them a lot on our backcountry adventures. Pretty tough setup to beat. That's it, folks. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. And as always, stay gritty.